idea is to question this and not to say that we need to get rid of this concept called a doctorate or doctor field. But the title below, text-based practice and brackets artistic research, I think is more important, since we will also speak about formats of how to receive, how to get awarded with a doctorate, doctor field, and this is usually the title for a university-style degree. And in order to understand this, I will give you a little introduction, a couple of minutes, but before doing that, I just let me introduce you to our guests. I will do that very briefly because the CVs of our guests are all on the website. Some of the people are already known to us, and it's also that we want to get into the discussion as quickly as possible, and this is not a lecture or lecture style. So it seems like I'm far from you, but so we will open this also very quickly. Announced were the names that you see on the slides, but we have discussions with other people in our department, with like colleagues with Simon Sheikh or Nina Chocke, who have been involved in other sections, so that we decided to moderate it this way. Other colleagues, of course, that we spoke with too. And then we invited two, let's say, key guests. That's Amrei, who is junior professor in Stuttgart, the University of Stuttgart, in the philosophy of technology and information. And your field of specialty is ethics, if I can say so. Many people know her already, perhaps not from her post as a teacher in Stuttgart, but because she's one of the initiators of a campaign that was called Ich bin Hanna. And that went viral, at least in the academic world, and it was about payment, contracts, social responsibility of universities, employment in a general sense, so also the question of professionalism in universities. Very successful, and it challenged policymakers and also led to significant changes in some legislation so far. It's still running. It's a campaign that you also, I think, produced a book on that with experiences so far. And then we have another guest whom you might know already as a teacher, guest professor in media art, that's Gerriet, who is both from Graz and Berlin, if I may say so, and he is a media artist who also received a doctorate, and the idea to invite him was to have a view on what that is from a different angle, because he combines the two experiences, like the university-style doctorate plus artistic work. And yes, Füsun, shall I introduce you? We are both moderating, but we did not have beforehand a conversation on how we deal with it. So Füsun Türetken, of course, as you know, is professor here for product design in HFG. And she will co-moderate, notably when it comes to the discussion, I think, with Gerriet. You have already prepared something. Let's see. I also want to thank, of course, the school for this, for making this possible, for the people behind the staging of this, and for preparing food, etc. So let's see. Just a couple of minutes to get you into the mood after the lunch break. Looking over our shoulder, historian of science, William Clark, who died some years ago. William Clark produced a research study, history, in 2006 with this title, Academic Charisma and the Origins of the Research University. If you see that book title, you would never really know what this is about, because academic charisma is a very complex title, and where exactly is the research university? Which one, which country, which planet are we what planet are we talking about? It is about the, let's say, tragic history of the German university, the tragic fortune of the German university, its development and how it spread all over the planet. He wrote this under the supervision of Lorraine Daston, a renowned historian of science, who also was director at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, that Armin Linke referred to, and is a professor of philosophy, history of philosophy in Chicago. And so this book is to remind us, or was to remind us, that the university is, that we speak about today, is perhaps not the same university that existed in medieval times. It's evolved over time, and notably it did so in Central Europe, in the German-speaking countries in particular. So although there were older universities in Padua, Bologna, and elsewhere, there is something going on in the German world. And the funny thing is that, notably in the age of Reformation, things significantly changed. One thing is that the medieval university only had the so-called magister, or master, the master of the arts, magister artium. And interestingly, even in medieval times, it was called the arts. Because the arts did not mean arts in today's sense, but liberal arts, meaning fundamental knowledge. Could be geometry, rhetoric, and logic, these things. That was the arts, and you were a master in that, and you taught people that. And so if you were a master, you were a teacher, and so you had the superior position already. Nothing above that, in a way. The fields of study, where you were professor in, were theology, jurisprudence or jurisdiction, and medicine. And something like philosophy as a discipline did not exist. It was these three, in Europe at least. So you were either a theologian or would become a lawyer, administrator, something like that, politician, or you were a physician, medicine, specialist in medicine. The doctorate did not exist at that time. It was just a loose title, like poet. There were lots of poets in universities. I mean, people who can talk and write, or write letters. And the doctorate existed only in a way in these fields like theology. So you had a doctor in Paris, who is somebody who is a specialist in reading the Bible and versatile languages. And but during the Reformation, something happened, and that is that more people, let's say, demanded to wear that title or degree and called themselves doctor. And that is what this book is about, like the evolution of this new concept. And then he traces, Bill Clark traced this development, and he studied all the universities there are, went into all the archives of European universities to find out where exactly when the first diploma was issued, the first magister was relabeled as doctor, and so on and so forth. So years and hundreds of thousands of pages of research to find out that only in the age of Reformation the doctorate appeared, the Doctor of Philosophiae, and was then countered in the counter-revolution by the Jesuits, who also promoted and used this title in their own schools or collegi. And then in the 18th century only, in Vienna, Bamberg, Jena, and other places, step by step, like in a domino effect, the magister disappeared and was replaced more and more by a doctor field. And the scheme that we know today, that you make a magister artium, or master of arts, or bachelor, master, and then perhaps a doctor, appeared first in Berlin in 1810 with the foundation of the new Berlin University. And not that they invented the doctor, but the scheme of first the magister and then the doctor on top is something new. So it's a result of the reformed universities like Göttingen and Berlin, and this model spread all over the planet. That's the funny thing. So perhaps not the kind of university, but the system. And sometimes it was not adopted. There are universities, or there were universities, where you could study until you get your doctorate and never received a magister, like in history of art that existed when I studied. This is important to understand this history, and that's why I wanted to mention it, because it's funny that in former times things were called Master of Arts, but Doctor of Philosophy, and we're in an art school, so I thought it's interesting. Then the doctorate at that time also becomes a written dissertation, and the written dissertation at that time in the 16th century is not a book that somebody writes and then defends. It is like a protocol of an examination. So I am the teacher, and somebody challenges my knowledge and gets examined. And if that examination is successful, it means I approve what you say. So you can now print my dissertation, meaning your examination. It's like a certificate. So that's also why these early dissertations are very brief. They're more like protocols of a conversation. And it's funny that the students had to pay for it, for their own career. So about justice. It was also connected to costume, to theater. There were stages, you had chairs, you had like levels, different levels of superiority. So people were wearing costumes in the double sense, costume, and also masks from time to time. So it was more like a play that you are initiated and adopted into the world of the academia. And then there's some evidence of compulsory printing meaning that you are obliged to print this dissertation when you write one, and that appeared for the first time, as far as we know, in 1570 in Freiburg, Baden. So, then followed Basel, 1575. It must have to do with the fact that this is also the area where book printing emerged, or became at least a big business. The Gutenberg age then produced much, or too much, that followed, so that means that then you get something that we all know now, that is the journal, the academic journal, or the review. And it's funny that it's still called journal, which sounds like a diary, like every day, like a journal, but it's something else. It's a report about what happens in the sciences. The review is somebody reads books for you, so you don't have to read all of them. The German word for that was Gelehrtenkalender. That still exists somewhere here and there. So there are so many books that you cannot really follow. And this is just an example by Eileen Fife. She's from Scotland, who has written a history only of one journal alone to see how old this model is and how big the impact was. Another example here is on history of reading, about Gerriet, a poet, and on the cover of this book you see a machine by Agostino Ramelli, which he invented in 1588 or around that, a machine which would allow you to compare different books at the same time, like a reading automaton. And I take this only as an example of mechanization of reading is necessary because you already have so many books and information that you need something to assist you. And that is the reason why there were also these journals. There was already the fair in Frankfurt and the Leipzig and too many books appearing, so you cannot read all of that. And even in the 16th century, somebody complained that if we force everybody to print their dissertation, then so many trees would have to be cut down that that's not sustainable because there's so much nonsense in these texts. You write them only for the sake of the university or for your career. It's paper. Wait. So, 16th century. There's also a book by Tony Grafton, which I already mentioned to Hanne some minutes ago, on Tony Grafton's fantastic book about the footnote. It's Tragic History by Tony Grafton, die tragischen Ursprünge der deutschen Fußnote, which is also about exactly that story. So, an old one. Erudition grows and grows and grows and grows by a knowledge that is copied and compiled, compared, and there's even a dissertation in the 17th century that is called On the Reasons Why Scholars Bring Nothing to Light. That's a dissertation. So, following, of course, then the Age of Enlightenment, of course. So in the Age of Enlightenment, of course, people say, let's focus on what this is about. Get to the chase. And people like Immanuel Kant then say, you know, we have to focus on the thesis in terms of challenging the old, not vice versa. Like challenging in terms of what is your thesis, meaning what do you want to tell that is new and not what we know already. And that is a scientific approach in the world, more positivist, that is still common around 1900. And let's say the fact that this is also very, let's say, a model for the scientific university and the rise of the sciences, the technical fields in particular, you can see this in the fact that most dissertations still around 1900 are only very short, 40 pages, 60 pages. This is a long one by Ludwig van Bertalanffy, about Fechner under Moritz Schlick's supervision, and it has only 80 pages. And so you can see that there is some, one can be shorter. Yeah, dissertations have since then, and I'm almost at the end, since then become bigger and bigger. The biggest one I received for a review, so for examination, had 6 volumes, 500 pages. So 3,000 pages. I said this will be difficult to print. At the time, the title was Fantastic Form und Zeit. It's a fantastic book with several, I don't know, 20,000 footnotes. And, well, there came some abbreviated version afterwards. So the reputation, that's something now we come to our discussion. The academic degrees still exist, the dissertation still exists, the obligation to print is still a factor, also a cost factor, it's very expensive. And we all know that there's a lot around like the abuse of titles, forgery, plagiarism, copying. Everything that is an effect of the inflation of the degree. You have to have, in order to have career in the university life, you need to have some kind of title degree, and that everything else follows that way. And the system also has flaws. And certain doctorates are less acknowledged than others. Like Dr. Med, it has a completely different esteem than a Dr. Phil. Dr. Renat, Dr. Paul. They have like they're faceted and become more complex. They are sometimes a sign of academic dependencies, even of exploitation. There can be a disease. There is, for instance, this book Promovieren. So it was very successful. Yeah. So it was very successful. We always had it on our shelf in another working group because many people get so frustrated when they work overtime on the dissertation. It has become some kind of a meme to have a doctorate. And then the funny thing is on the right that I just want to show also for amusement, but to get some, let's say, different angle in here. That is, whenever you look up doctorates, Dr. Root, you will always find billions of examples that people are wearing strange square hats and throw them in the air, which is somehow, perhaps that happened somewhere, I don't know, 200 years ago in America. But it's still the meme for a doctorate. And there you can see that it has become something totally obscure, what we're doing. It's still theatrical. And if you take that, if you tell your own parents, no, I will not get such a hat. I will not get such a hat. And they are totally disappointed. Then you think, okay, what are we doing? What exactly are we doing here? So I thought that is a good occasion, this conference in an art school, to speak with specialists who deal with the problem of professional education in higher education, or people who have also, let's say, suffered from writing a dissertation. That's something you suffer from. I did suffer from it 3 years. What is making sense of that? And two questions that I have in mind particularly is, why do we do that? Like, why did I write a doctorate? Well, what's my motivation? And what could be a future model for that under the circumstances we live in? So that's what I wanted to start with. And if it's possible, I hand over to Amrei.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think regarding the question why you would start such a thing, also with regard to my own reasons, there would be 3 answers. The first thing is what you just mentioned, that you need a certain qualification. The second one is that you want to make a contribution to academia, to research, to a certain area of work. And the third one is that you have some sort of epistemic interest. And I think maybe it's also like a ranking. So you start with, okay, I want to have this qualification because I need it for my career, as you just mentioned. And there already it gets problematic, because if you are required to get such a thing, then you will be dependent on somebody who will supervise the thesis, for instance, and who is probably also your boss. So there you already see that there is something that might go wrong. With regard to the contribution thing, I think we see already with the doctorate that you have those warped incentives in academia that you've also mentioned. For instance, we are all supposed to publish a lot, and we are all supposed to add to some research that there already is, and therefore we might not be very innovative, because otherwise people might be angry with us if we don't repeat what they have already said. So that is some sort of mainstreaming that is happening there, for instance. So that also doesn't work quite well. And with regard to the epistemic interest, I think that would be like the main reason why you would start such a thing. And interest is maybe even too little to say. It's like you have this wish to find out about something that you're really curious about. And I think that's the thing. If I would try to give a vision as to how a doctorate, how a Dr. Phil could look in the future, I would say that should be in the focus. Not so much, do I get this degree and do I then make a contribution to a not very well designed academic system where lots of things go wrong, but to have this idea of I want to find out about a certain thing, and I want to do that without being afraid to fail, because of the qualification thing, you always think, okay, if this goes wrong, I mean, I have a limited time. You've also mentioned the financing. I mean, I have a limited time with the contract, if I have one at all. So I have a limit to when I need to be finished, and if I have to take a detour or something goes wrong, then this might disturb the whole project. And I mean, I might not be able to pay my rent after all. But I think we need a system where people can really risk something without having to risk their livelihood. And that would be the vision that I have, that people really come up with an idea without having to think, okay, will anybody be annoyed about that in the academic community, or will I risk something because I cannot finish the thing? So we need to have some sort of I don't know, some net that you will fall into as soon as something goes wrong. And I think that would be an ideal that I would advocate for.
And if I'm asked right back, what have you an idea how it could look like, such a net? You don't think about a let's say, insurance system, I suppose. What is that?
Yeah, the first thing would
it's
be
more like a family.
Yeah, I mean, that's also something. The whole system is designed in a way where you, there is competition all the time, right? You will compete with everybody. And that is really weird, because if we want to create knowledge and also if we want to create art and so on, collaboration is key. And I find it very disturbing that you always have to compete with other people, because that is really something that goes against this collaborative aspect of creating knowledge. And therefore, I think having a community where you can discuss things and not in a way where people will try to look better themselves by criticizing you. I've seen this in academia a lot, that people will criticize something just to show that they are smarter than you, and they will destroy what you have presented because they can do that in order to show that they are smarter than you. So let's not do this, let's be constructive. And also, a very pragmatic thing is that people need enough time. So if you only have 3 years or less than that, that you are financed for your thesis. If you take a look at average times that people need for a PhD, it's about 6 years, but payment is much less, so you already see that people will struggle there, and I think that's something that we need to get rid of.
Yes, thank you. So, just because I forgot it, I was searching for Céline Condorelli when I was sitting down, she's over there. So I wanted to mention that name for several reasons. One is that she also had a discussion with me about this panel, and she is a professor for exhibition design and research here at HFG and holds a PhD title. And so if there's a chance, I will also give the microphone to you for a response if you like. And of course we have other people here who I wanted to mention at least before I hand over to Gerriet, and that is Felix Mittelberger. Where is he? Ah, of course, right in front. And Petra Zimmermann, who is she here? Not yet. Okay, I wanted to mention these two names just briefly because I did not have a chance in the beginning to localize you. That we also approached you in for this discussion because Felix is head of the archive of ZKM and Petra Zimmermann head of the library. So she has to deal with the fact that every day there is a new book produced, academic books, and she has to shelve them. And you have to deal with growing quantities, and we are coming into some kind of anthropical dimension where we don't know how to deal with that anymore, including even electric data, like digital data, that servers explode. So there is some kind of quantity problem as well that you have to tackle with, and we usually leave it to some experts, leave it to the IT, leave it to archive, and so on. And we just produce. And that's also not really fair. We have to get some kind of new sustainability also in, let's say, knowledge production. I just wanted to say this in between us, but sorry. So, Gerriet, can we pass on?
Das hier verwenden? Ja. Motivation. I think that's actually the most important topic, because you said it. When I was introduced to the idea of artistic research, that was 2008 in Graz, and one of my former mentors gave a lecture on it. And so after that, we went, like the whole group went for dinner, and I was a little bit confused, like artistic research. And then I asked him, okay, if I understand this right, it's for lame artists, pimping up their work, or for scientists who want to be a little bit more sexy. And he was like, everyone was like, of course I was right. These people from the beginning of the 2000s opened up a field that, of course, revealed chances in the middle of two poles that I was just mentioning. And I thought, all right, okay, maybe there's something for me. Why? Because if you do something for a while, like most of us do, like practitioners, there's always something that you feel you could, you want to go deeper. You cannot. Nothing can come between you and your work. It's like, because you deliver, produce, whatever you do, you produce. And then there's something like this residue that's always there. Like some people call it the toxic knowledge. But something that you feel, okay, it's always in there, and I want to explore this more. And I was at this point. And I was at the point where I wanted to talk with my colleagues, like media artists, especially in sound, about what is there, what I feel is there, but they wouldn't talk about it. Like it's just, it was not, no, we go this way, and there were certain streams in every profession. And so, for me, that was a chance to say, wait a minute, if I can get into this artistic, scientific doctoral school that we have in Graz, so it's not straight artistic research, I might have the chance to explore this more. Right? And in my field, it was the idea of sculpturality in sound, which everyone said, like everyone said, oh, that's so old. And said, wait a minute, maybe we have to go deeper here. Like and so I had the chance to do so, and I think it was at least 5 times with this research here at ZKM, and ZKM published a book after that. So it really helped me to communicate. So that was good. But for me, it's super important to really ask the question, why doctorates? Art is great. Why should you write a Beipackzettel manual? So and the other way around, like science, I mean, we should definitely think a little bit about, I mean, since yesterday I'm thinking this here about our picture, our idea of science. Because, like, for example, speculation is at the heart of science. Only they cannot sell it like that, sure. But if you work like I did for 11 years in the same room with the scientists, you see that how creative they work. Like maybe the most creative people I was working with in the past 10, 15 years with scientists, like speculating with math, like, oh, let's assume like this and that, and you think like, it's allowed? Wow, that's hot, like you doing this, like, and then of course, in the end, there is some reasoning method and so, but I think it's super important if you think about all these doctorates, it's not only personal motivation, I said something about this, but also the question, why doctorate? Why not something else? Or why just leave it there?
Yeah. My name is Füsun, and as Céline, I do hold a PhD doctorate degree from Goldsmiths, University of London. And I would like to come back to something that we discussed yesterday, Gerriet, and probably today as well, which was the notion of why did we even think of going into a PhD doctorate program, right? And I think the biggest motivation back then was exactly not at the edge of any neoliberal interest or any academic success story that we needed to do it, but we had the liberty to do so. But we were also always joking about this at Goldsmiths. We were also invited to pay, right? Because we had to pay, even if it's a small amount of money, we had to pay for this in a sort of part-time manner. Professionals who had already a sort of mid-career, but then were extending on things that they really wanted to investigate. In my personal case, which we also discussed, what our personal motivations were and whether we could learn something for a larger outcome, a degree of audience about our personal motivations, was that we said, we were so much in the notion of production, of, working in the cultural field, producing 14 exhibitions, 5 publications and whatnot, that you did not have time to breathe in terms of you could not investigate a topic in depth, which for me was a pivotal and crucial point of going to Goldsmiths, but also I wanted to get away of white German academia, right? So I'm not from Germany originally, I come from Istanbul, and what I really found at Goldsmiths at the table was the world was invited to be at that table. And that was really important, and whereas we could criticize these roundtables or programs, I'm still very grateful that Professor Dr. Gerriet back then, in the early 2000s, had installed these programs at the Visual Culture Department, one of them being the Curatorial Knowledge PhD program, Master as well as PhD, and then the other one being Research Architecture, also Master and PhD. So this is essential maybe to say. Then I would like to say maybe one more comment about the different degrees, and I think I would like to go a little bit back on what Amrei and Matthias were saying. We do have the doctorate, we do have the PhD, which in essence is just a philosophy degree, Doctor of Philosophy, also equals DR, Doctor. But then we have a new notion that is an Erasmus program, which is called Creator Doctus, the third cycle. And I remember when I first had encountered it, little did I know about it. So I went to a couple of conversations, conferences, to acquaint myself with this knowledge, and I understood that they were trying to propose possibilities for research of different formats, but also universities who could not achieve a doctorate program, right? So they were thinking what could be the alternatives to a doctorate program. And I think from my position, I would argue that I am fine with having this sort of polyphony of doctorate titles. I am not against them. I would not argue against any of these. I would believe that everybody who engages in such a format knows what they're up to. As you said, sometimes it's a 6-year journey, sometimes you're lucky to have an excellence cluster and you're finished in 4 years. Not everybody has that privilege, right? But I think we have to come to these kind of notions. And maybe to connect one more thought to the last panel, which I really liked, was the idea of discussing the footnote. Maybe that's a good way to also start what we kind of can offer as people coming from different disciplines, not necessarily as practitioners, by the way, I would say. When you come from architecture or urban studies or graphic design, you do not have to be precisely a practitioner. You can also study at a university, and it could, already in your education, you can go into a different realm. But from a graphic design point of view, I would like to make a reference to a book, which I think Matthias would love if he saw it. It's a book where the footnote takes over. So we know books where you have the main body of text, and then you have the footnote. Maybe you all know the book that I'm talking about. And all of a sudden, this author played with the footnote. So the footnote eats up the main body of text. It also becomes the gateway from one side or one page to the other. And I'd like to think a little bit about PhDs or doctorate titles exactly like that, where you can use your speculative, your fictional, your fantasy, your whatever knowledge and tools you have in order to also experiment, as did this author, with the format of the book, where you really creatively think about what do we do. And the reason why I'm saying this is, for example, Lawrence Abu-Hamdan at our roundtable at Goldsmiths really completely changed the format of the PhD, and he completely challenged Goldsmiths by doing an entire PhD in audio. But what is audio? It's basically based on text. Thank you. Sorry, it was more of a comment than a question, but I think it's very important to discuss.
I want to go back to that, and if there's questions from the audience, start right away giving a sign. Sometimes I show you my cold shoulder here in the back, but please just make yourself audible, because we're already in the discussion. And I know that there's people from different fields here, different experiences, different interests, expectations, etc. And that is, of course, it's a bit complicated then to discuss it, but on the other hand, that's the chance, because you hardly have discussions like this in this very open sense, I think. And so I wanted to go back to, adopting your point, going back to the question of vision and make another round. That is, I think there is two different fields, or two different sectors of discussion. That's what I wanted to try to highlight in the intro. That is that on the one hand you have, let's say, the format of a dissertation. Format meaning, or the degree, it is something like a format of academic life. It is a lifetime, it's a certain cycle, has a certain duration, and it ends with some kind of certificates, for instance. It could be a doctorate or something else. You could issue other things, and that's a something to start with creatively. You could say, instead of giving away a doctor title, you could say, well, in the art schools you also have Meisterschülerin, you have master in a completely different sense that is not limited to writing. It's about being there at for a certain time under supervision of a certain person. You get something in the end that is perhaps completely different, but it gives you something. So what exactly is it about that you want to give, what you want to get? Could it be like a second kind of diploma? Could it be just a project that you said, you know, I've been working in this project for 3 years and in my CV it will show up. Who cares about a doctor? But so that is one thing, like what does it count, what is it labeled like, and on the other hand, the role of the written or the role of the spoken word, that's the subtitle, which is something different. I think it is connected, but it's not identical, because there are programs like doctorate in university styles. It is almost entirely writing a dissertation for a very long time, very expensive, mostly too long, I find. So, yeah, definitely. And we are compiling, and only 5% of the book is new content, and the rest is text, although it's in fact a footnote. Because you comment what's written in the library. And my personal idea as a vision, a new vision, if I may just, perhaps you don't subscribe to that, there are some problems with that, but if the dissertation was just a manual, you could say my main theses are 1, 2, and 3, and the relevant books you need for that are in the library. So if the library is a good one, then you will have your sources. So why should I repeat what's written in that, in that book? And then you could say, well, you could do a lot with AI today, and that also leads us, if we are now living in the age of AI, whatever AI can emulate is something we don't need to do ourselves. It just shows that AI can do it, which means we have to focus on what we can do, and that is like argumentation, new ideas, also in the written form. So what would be, if we have these two different fields, what could be like a way out to have some kind of new innovative form of a dissertation-like format, with or without doctorate, but how can we get out of this, let's say, loop of producing and compiling and repeating what's already known and then print 300 pages and put it on the shelf? What would be your response to that?
Yeah, those are very tricky questions, obviously. So regarding this question, how to redesign the whole process, maybe, I would agree that there's lots and lots of, so there's already so much that is being written that nobody can read it anymore. And if we put AI into the calculation, then we see that this will be even worse. So that we should limit what is happening there. And I think something that is worth noting here, especially with regard to AI, is that texts are not just containers of thoughts and arguments, but they are also a way of writing. A text is also a way of thinking and of letting other people see what you think and follow your thought. And I think this would be something that interests me, at least, to figure out those practices and why they are important to us, and why it is important to us that this thing is not being written by some sort of large language model, but by myself.
And how could we foster that? That is more oriented on this getting beyond just being a container. How could we train that? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing with the footnote that is taking over is also such a fascinating thing, because it kind of disrupts the structure that we all have in mind. And I mean, I'm socialized, so my socialization is that of an analytic philosopher. So analytic philosophy works like this. Here is the small problem X. Some people have written about it. All of them have not mentioned a certain tiny aspect Y. And I will now talk about that aspect, and I will do this with the following argument, 1, 2, 3, and then I do this, and in the end I write a conclusion that says, okay, there was this problem X, and some people have written about it, they haven't seen that there is a tiny aspect Y, I have written about that, I have presented my argument 1, 2, 3, and I succeeded. And that is, I think, sorry, I mean, it's a little bit sarcastic maybe, but I think it's rather boring. So I want to read other kinds of papers, and I think that's also something, if we ask the question why AI will not substitute all of us, then we need to figure out ways of getting outside this mainstream structure of certain arguments and so on, and think about how to start anew, and also maybe have bridges between different schools, but also different areas, research, art, and so on, to see where we can learn from others, which is very difficult because at first you need to find a common language and so on. Everybody who has tried this already knows that this is tricky, but I think that would be a starting point, that you are more free in what you are doing without having those structures that you are always have to work with.
See, my question would be, would you want to respond to that? Because there's already a question from the audience.
Maybe only shortly. One question that seems super important to me is who's teaching the teachers. So we see all these doctoral schools appear. And for example, I have 4 supervisors. 2 internal, artistic and scientific, and 2 external. And you know, this feeling of being in the Roman arena, like with the 4 horses, it shaped me, yes, my resistance. But you can see, like, I want this from you, and then there are others like, I want this from you, I don't care what the others say. And then, no, you come here and you do this. And like, whoa, wait a minute, you know? But this is really, when you start thinking, who's actually, you know, setting the standards, you know, to ask the questions. Like, doctorants, if it's a doctoral program, are asked to come up with at least 1 research question. But the question, like, how we research should be solved before that. And there should be a common sense. And that's a big problem for like, how long something can take. And the quality of the outcome, and how personal this can become. Or are just fulfilling ideas of other people of research. So who's teaching the teachers is something super important to me.
Yeah, in my life I was forced to combine text with artistics because I studied chemistry to understand life forces and then ended in medical history, but tried an image-based chemistry, and then I ended with Warburg. That's what I want to add. I'm really a fan of Warburg's Bilderatlas because he combined iconic images and connects them a little bit, and at this point we may add Novalis, because I was so amazed in Romantic times how Novalis addressed chemistry, and I think in the Allgemeine Brouillon, unbelievable. So he used word or series of words which go to the universe of the cosmos. So my idea would be an artist-based research, and remember Warburg brought Cassira, one of my heroes there, Edgar Bind, a really good philosopher, then Panofsky. So he really combined artists and text in an unbelievable way, and today I live in Hamburg, I can tell you, don't tell to others, they are not so sexy anymore. I miss hot spirits there, so I think it's still a work to do to continue with Warburg's amazing Bilderatlas.
I can only applaud to that coming from Hamburg, of course. There's one point that for those who know it, the Bilderatlas is very popular here among students. Perhaps not for everybody, but it is known. And also here in Karlsruhe in particular, because a big research project on the Süden-Atlas was conducted by Alex Heil at the Academy, and then led to the big show, Haus der Kultur der Welt. And why I mention this is because the Bilderatlas is if you will, a map. Like a map is the cartography of images that are connected to each other. And that makes them similar to a kind of text web, like the hypertext that was invented due to the internet, and then in the 90s, and then the World Wide Web evolved from that in the late 90s. And people then discovered the Bilderatlas. Was a Dutch information scientist, computer scientist, who discovered this concept of the Bilderatlas. He redid it in the HTML version, and said that the idea of the Bilderatlas is like a text that has a main narrative, and then lots of margins and annotations and footnotes. So you surf through the text by having a footnote, and then you leave the text, the main text, and then you come to some other information. And then you could even introduce a second order footnote, like a footnote to the footnote, and so on. And in the end you get something that was then called hypertext. And so many scientists, and that's the part that I find very interesting, but Gerriet mentioned this, I've been working with lots of scientists, not scholars, not humanities people, so from art history, but scientists in terms of, data-driven empirical studies, people from, physics, medicine, and other fields, who have a completely different way of handling information and of writing. And scientific papers today are highly formalized. You have always the abstract, keywords, list of illustrations, then a core text that contains of 2 pages perhaps, and one letter to nature can have more impact than 300 pages of a dissertation in the arts. And the funny thing is that all the texts that I've written, it's a long list of articles and 1 or 2 books and lots of edited books, all of them do not count. They are not publications in terms of the sciences. Only the ones that I edited, published in peer-reviewed journals. And the rest is no publication. It is not public, not in their eyes. There you can see how this has completely evolved into something different, standardized, normalized, and that is also, you could say that is like, it's a dead end. It is something that has no brains inside. There is no spirit. It is just a machinery. It's about patents and production and so on. On the other hand, it also has rules that I find interesting, because people do follow rules that many other people don't follow. They just write a lot of stuff. And then it ends in the shelf, which is not productive. I find it not productive just to fill the library. So there is something in between that we're looking for, I think. And I still haven't found it.
But I'm not sure, thank you so much for the question. I'm not sure it does not exist. I think what we have to understand is that maybe the question is based wrongly. I wouldn't even go and engage in these kind of dichotomies. I think we could say that, at Goldsmiths, for example, sorry to come back to that, we had text equally to our artistic, whatever we call it, whether that is production or research or engagement. And both of them were read as text, or both of them were read as image. That's one thing. I'm not such a fan of these also disciplinary decadences, where we divide certain disciplines into speculative design, critical design, investigative, because I think all of these adjectives just double confirm what you're actually trying to say. It's still one of those visual or spatial or design practices. I think these kind of fights over territory are not helpful. What I'm interested in also in teaching and learning from students and colleagues is more this sort of transdisciplinary. And we have at this house, we have the interdisciplinary curriculum, right? I think that's what also makes HFG so wonderful, that we have students able to choose from different courses, which you rarely have. And I would see the PhD as a continuation of education. And I think education, I'm sorry if this sounds ridiculous, is very, very important due to political settings that we're in or have been. But where I find a doctorate or a PhD, however it is called, becomes really problematic is when it becomes a neoliberal project of education, where you can look at the Netherlands or Holland, you can look at England, where they're doing this on a professional level. Students are called cash cows. I've been part of departmental meetings where, sorry to say, students were exactly called that. So if you treat programs such as such a currency, I think then that becomes problematic. And then, I think that's more the meta to look at, maybe. I don't know if you would agree, but I would love to hear more about that, for example. How can we escape that sort of logic of neoliberal production? I wouldn't necessarily question the education as such.
Perhaps Amrei has an idea on that. I can imagine, because now we come also to business. Bildungsindustrie, the German word. If somebody establishes a PhD program, my first question is, do you do it for the money? So like to get international students, or do you have some interest in content? And it doesn't... Only for the money. It doesn't even have to be a contradiction, but we are now in this field, and that is also something that is important to discuss.
Yeah, and I think we are already in a system where it's quite similar, because already, for instance, if you take a look at even the core funding, there is this so-called Zukunftsvertrag, which is there to give the universities money to improve teaching, And there already we see that you need to make sure that students finish in a certain, so they need like Regelstudienzeit, so the average time or the time that you should need to finish your studies plus 2 semesters. And so my incentive as a teacher is push them through as quickly as I can, because then the money flows. So that is something that is, I think, a problem. And also with regard to grant money and third-party funding and so on, so we already have a limited amount of core funding for universities, and everybody struggles. So everybody needs this grant money that somebody has to get, and there you need to write all those long applications. I've done that myself several times. Most of them will be unsuccessful. So what you do is you put lots and lots of money and resources into this hyper competition that is a pseudo competition in a way as well. Because I mean, if you have 10 applications and 8 out of 10 are very, very good, but you can only fund 3, then you will fund 3 and the other 5 will just be for the bin. And you can do that again and again, and you can have lots of people read those things and write those things, and that's what we are doing right now. And I think that's part of the problem, that you treat universities and education as if they were a business thing. But it's not. I mean, it's something different. And I think in order to get to a point where we get rid of this, we need to discuss again what education even is, what our idea of education is. Also with regard to AI, if we ask ourselves how far are we going to include this into teaching and research, we also have to ask ourselves, what is it that is like the core thing about, for instance, philosophy, my discipline? What are people supposed to learn if I teach them philosophy? And when can I say if they walk out here, they have learned what it is to be a philosopher? And that's, of course, a very meta-abstract discussion, but I think we need this in order to get rid of this neoliberal system.
Only a small aspect. I think we can start by the question how we structure the whole procedure. For example, in Graz, you cannot finish your master and apply for the doctorate. It's absolutely important to know. You have to be out there a couple of years, come back with your practice. Which is, for some people, not very smart, because we, like in Graz, they don't get all the people. Like, they get certain people. Also, they have to say no to very good people. With interesting questions, but that is this gap, is actually producing a different, in my experience, approach. Like when you come back to university, like being out there for a long time, you really have to think hard. Like, should I really, do this? And then you have a different motivation, and also the school, the doctoral school, can say, okay, there's a different motivation behind this, like in theory, but it will break this, career path. For example, in Scandinavia, a lot of people do bachelor, master, all funded, and then there are a huge amount of monies for the doctorals. So you are 35 before you do your first own exhibition, but you've been inside academia all the time, so all the titles, so you can want this, but I'm a little bit critical about this, especially when it comes to this neoliberal, like you do this, and that, and you guarantee your path.
Yeah, that's really an important point, because this rupture, this split, this division that is taken there in Graz, that is something that I think would challenge a lot of universities who say, usually we have students, and if they are promising ones among them, we will continue supporting them somehow. That's how they sell it. And then you have a program for them, for the good ones in a way, and it's also professionalized in terms of stipends, money, jobs. Some assistant positions are just identical with holding, writing a doctorate. But that would mean that you really send people away all the time, like your own people, send them away and open to another market. And I think it is of course a risky move, because then many people will say, okay, master and then out, or diploma and then out. So that's something just to highlight that, and that is a completely different. That's a shift, like shifting, right? And that many institutions will not be willing to do. That was the question. Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to hear if Céline, for example, has something to add. Would you take my seat for a minute?
You have no choice.
So sorry to put you out on the spot.
Yeah, well,
Forgive
bring
me.
people, bring more voices.
We can also share.
No, but maybe something I'd like to pick up on is an earlier comment that was part of this panel. Is the notion that artistic research is something new, which it blatantly isn't. And I'm also looking towards Monica there, because when I started in the PhD program, there were definitely many people, including Rex Media Collective, who had been practicing artistic research for decades. But also the history of art is full of artists who do research. Of course, anyone who does anything knows that the question is not of the fact that the research didn't exist, it's how that research is examined or even considered or acknowledged as research, right? The problem is not the problem of contribution, the problem is the recognition of that contribution. And the disciplinary nature of academia is that people who do things like artistic research do not belong in academia. This is the never-ending argument. This is why artists are asked to write 750 pages PhDs in order to prove that what they're doing is a contribution to academia. They were doing research all along, right? So there are different practices that are at stake here. But let's recognize what is recognizable. Perhaps one of the problems is this problem of assessment. Who's going to be there to recognize that that research is actually valid and an argument in its own right without the 250 footnotes and the 700 pages? Which, by the way, historically the footnotes are always a way of relegating collective labor to the smallest text on the page, because of course any type of research is also collective.
It's fine, that's fine. Okay, you wanted to feel cozy?
Yeah, I do. And I also thought that adds to what you have said, Matthias, about what counts as a publication. So, I mean, there is so much gatekeeping going on there, also in what you've just mentioned, that somebody will decide whether this is worthy of being called research or something like that. And I think that is really also hindering, success and also development of what is happening in those disciplines in a way, because you will stop that from happening, because there is this reputation thing that you've also mentioned in your introduction, Matthias, where you need to question yourself, what do I do in order to get the reputation of the community? And some things count and others don't. For instance, doing something publicly, which is called science communication, at least in some disciplines, okay, that is something that people don't want for some reason. I think also sometimes for the wrong reason. So if you do that, you might risk your career. So if you have this streamlined career, and also what I think is problematic about the whole neoliberalism thing is, if you do something successful, then you have been lucky, and if you fail, then it's your fault. And nobody cares about the structures that have been setting you up to fail all along. And that's something what I really don't like about this whole discussion. For instance, if people run out of money and they are blamed for that, even though it was pretty clear from the start that they couldn't do their project in the amount of time that they get the funding for. And then they are blamed. I mean, I've seen this myself. I was unemployed during my PhD and I was told, okay, so that's your fault, obviously. But I only got 3.5 years of payment and then a little stipend after that. So I was way below average of finishing a PhD in philosophy, but nobody cares about that. And I think this kind of individualization of problems, instead of highlighting that they are structural, it also makes sure that the system as it is stabilized. Because if people realize at some point that those are structural problems, what we are trying to do with our Ich bin Hanna campaign, that you see all of a sudden there are many people on unemployment money who do research because they don't get enough funding, or there are many people who struggle with the same things that you struggle with. And also, by the way, not just general things, but also for certain marginalized groups in academia who will struggle with certain things. You need to highlight them in order to get rid of them, because otherwise everybody will always tell you it's your own fault and there is no problem on structural level in the first place.
Maybe just as a disclaimer for those who do not know, the Ich bin Hanna project or initiative, it's also specifically about wissenschaftliche MitarbeiterInnen, academic associates, and their prospective futures within academia and their precarious situations. Is that about right as a very brief summary?
Yeah, so there we have seen how much power this brings if you highlight that those are structural problems, because we've started to build this community. And I mean, the reason was that there was this law, or there is this law still, that will make sure that you can only get 12 years of fixed-term contracts. Thank you. In the time that you work in academia, and if you don't get a permanent position by then you're kicked out of the whole system. And we have criticized this, but also we have created this community, and in order to do that, we understood that we have to get rid of those abstract descriptions of problems. We've done that before. We have described the problems on this abstract level and said, okay, there are too many fixed-term contracts in academia and so on. But what was special about the Ich bin Hanna campaign was that people exposed themselves and said, okay, so if you work in German academia, that's how it's like. That's how it's like to not be sure that you can pay your rent in half a year. That's how it's like to always move the place where you work, because then you get a contract somewhere else for a year, and then you need to move again, and if you have a family, that's tricky, and if you do care work, that's very tricky, because there is no place in that for academia and so on. And I think talking about those things, not just on the abstract level, but also on a personal level, will make you see how prevalent those problems are, structural problems.
I wanted to reply to Celine's comment, because I'm very thankful for that, in that regard, that for me it's a question also for how can we be part of that process which leads to a result, which then leads to this title, right? Because it's not only the finished thing, it's the way where we on it to achieve it. And there the institution itself has some responsibility to be part of that, but also to be to document and help to create something which can be then a result. Because it does not have to be text, right? It could be something different. It could be the text in a PhD is basically shows what you have done the last couple of years, and then and gives the answer perhaps to the question you start with. But if the institution is not good at assist you on your way to something, then it can become very problematic. And I think, and this I'm speaking for ZKM basically, but then we are not good at documenting our stuff as well, but as HFG, as I was a student as well, it also has to work on it's helping their students, also ongoing PhD students, to document what they do here and what could be the result of it. It's really a structural problem, not only to establish this title, but also to create structures to help this title achieve.
Thank you. Can I respond to that? So briefly, that is, I thought about it while listening, that there's one aspect very important in this, that is the institution as such, the institution of academic life. If you take somebody like conceptual artists around after 1900, like Marcel Duchamp and company, they place a piece of porcelain somewhere and it makes a scandal. It takes years to come to that point. Just thinking, conceptual-wise, strategies, ideas, discussions, research. It's research. The result as such is something totally everyday. But you need an institution. That's something that is there. It's visible and also invisible. It takes an institution like the museum to make it a scandal. It takes a history of art to give it a genealogy, to make it a narrative. It takes the idea of the avant-garde to make it convincing, and so on and so forth. It's all in there. But the piece as such it's conceptual, it's, let's say, mind-driven, it's content, but it does not have to be a 300-page dissertation. It's still intellectual, in a way, and the discourse around it is intellectual. So the question that also Gerriet and you mentioned, the institution, the framework, the community, it has been part of that process even in earlier times. Gatekeeping is important, but the question that I now have is how can we rebuild it, redesign it, remodel it in a way that it makes more sense under the contemporary circumstances. So we will not overcome the need for the grades, for promotion, we will not get rid of that, and I think we don't even want that. We will not get rid of the Bildungsindustrie, all of these economic factors of the people who, we will not change the international system of universities, the fact that there's art schools and universities, that there's American-style universities or English ones and then German ones, state universities. all these, we will not overcome that, but under the circumstances we're in, how can we get a little further? And that's why I thought, if you just, and that's in the abstract of this panel, if you just took a, let's say, a pencil, and the designer says, I think about the use of a pencil for 2 decades now, or a chair. I think about it. That is human engineering, that is industry, that is reproduction, that is, the use of plastic, that's sustainability. It's all in this design. And when I put that on the table, why are there people saying this is not research, or this is not even science? Of course it is, but it's a different angle. And then the question is, how can we get to a common angle? And that's, for me, still like a question mark.
I think what always helps is if you are able to formulate a question, not just put something on the table. Unless you put something on the table as a question, and people understand it as a question. So I can, of course, say there's so much experience in there. Look at it. But I think what is much more doctoral and also opening up community is when you are able to find a home for the process that led to this, like also the discussions between the people who work around or the field of Duchamp. So the doctoral school would actually open the possibility to watch other people's approaches, and then we grow. It's not just I'm the ego, like on my path, and in the end I have a doctorate, and then I can be a professor because that's written in the new Hochschule, whatever Gesetz that you. And so you know what I mean? Just know that you have an intrinsic feeling. I have to ask this question and see other people asking their questions, and then we grow, because that's what we actually call the process of the experiment. And so we're not first of all looking at the product, but on the process of development.
That's why sorry, there's one I have to ask just before I forget it, because like an experiment can be a constructed question mark. It's an architecture of a question mark. It says, we put something in and we have results, so it's built. This room can be a question mark. The pencil can be a question mark. And my point now is, how can we guarantee, what can we do to make this visible, that this is the point? Because this room here is an argument, as such. It's a built argument. It has a history, it has a development, it has an aesthetic. It is a fact, scientific fact. This room is a fact. But how? How do we get there, and how do we judge it, and who sees it? That's my point. Like as you said, who judges the judges? So who is then doing that revision, that review? And that's, I think, the key point. Otherwise, we will not get ahead. We will just put 2 experts together, one from the design field, one from theory, and let them discuss. But they don't really see them. They just quarrel with each other. And I think we are looking for something slightly different, like you said. Sorry, that was a remark. And then, wait, what?
Yeah, I see. Watch out. I see it a bit like you just said. I think it's not about the titles. It's about creating moments of collective encounters or community or fellow colleagues where you can discuss your work or learn from them. I mean, that's what academia is about. To fight, to discuss, not on a personal level, but about what you're interested in. And I think this is what these doctorate programs can provide, hopefully. In my personal case, I have an Israeli, London-based supervisor, and I had a Palestinian, Beirut, Washington, Berlin-based supervisor, also politically looking at today, very interesting. And then of course, 3rd and 4th, whoever they are, from both genders or trans, also doesn't matter, but definitely transnational. And I think all of them came from different disciplines and outlooks and methodologies. And it was also, you can speak about our roundtables. It was such a pleasure to be able to talk about things in depth with time and space. And I think it was a game changer, a life changer. So once you're aware of the dynamics at hand in education, how it is being materialized, you can also benefit from that. And I think maybe that's something that I'm more interested to talk about than, again, creating boundaries and dichotomies. I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry.
Can I just add something on a slightly more positive note, because I feel like we're really like killing the doctor film. I gave it quite a little while. So one of the primary motivations for me to apply for a job in Germany is that there are some of the really horrendous things that are happening in higher education in the UK that are not happening here. Yeah, most of the students I teach, some of them might struggle financially, but they're not in debt, and they're definitely not in debt in like hundreds of thousands of pounds. Everybody's got a contract. They're not all good contracts, but there's nobody on 0-hour contracts. And the universities where I taught were full of people on 0-hour contracts. I'm sure most people here don't even know what that is, right? Contracts that guarantee absolutely nothing, not even an hour of sick leave. So within a notion of what a postgraduate could be, a place like this is one of the few places where you even have the time or space to think about it, you know, like the possibility to imagine further education in a way that is not completely disempowered and completely driven by business. Having said this, I don't have such good memories of roundtable as you do. Totally intimidating. That's true for the first 2 years.
Yeah, it's always good to break up a bit the thinking, to switch media. We talked a lot about visual arts, we talked a lot about design, a bit of music. So, but I was thinking, what about literature? So, and then it becomes interesting. What about a poet or somebody who wrote, we say, fiction? He writes fiction in Deutsch, Roman. A very interesting art piece. And if we take up this vocabulary we are talking about today, of course you would say, okay, this is artistic research. But a writer would never talk about, say, well, this is artistic research. Or a theater piece, so you have performance coming in. So, but they would never think about to talk about artistic research. So it's just a reflection to bring into switching media.
I'm not sure I understand. You mean in those terms? They wouldn't use those words?
Yeah, yes. Well, if you look for people in literature, a writer, they have an academic, most of them have an academic background. Some of them even have a Dr. Phil, yes. But they would never say, okay, my book, my piece of fiction is a dissertation.
Yeah, you have similar forms in science or in scholarly research as well, because for instance in philosophy you have thought experiments and you have this whole debate about storytelling, and that resembles very much what you've just mentioned. If you have a novel, then this is not that different from telling, for instance, I mean you might all know the trolley case, this thing where the train is about to hit a person, and if you divert it to another direction, then other people will be hit by it, and then the question is what you should you do? And I mean that is a narrative form of saying something about certain theories in ethics, for instance, to utilitarianism idea where you want to save as many people as possible, or the ontological ethics where you say, okay, we are not allowed to kill anyone no matter what, or something like that. And I think that's interesting, that if I do this in philosophy, then that's research, and if I write like a short story with the same content, then it's not.
So my microphone is somewhere else.
Yes, here. Maybe I would like to return to this question of the object, whatever it is, placed on the table without, you use the word Beipackzettel to denounce the written thesis coming sometimes with it. And I'm wondering, well, also in scientific disciplines, the result of a research that is presented in a dissertation that can be very brief. Sometimes it could be summed up in a formula, but nevertheless it is not placed on the table just as a formula usually. So how you present the result of your research depends on to whom you speak. And I agree that one could evaluate this result, being it a formula or a pencil or whatever, without showing the research process going into this object or formula, if you have the right people in the room, exactly this peer group, like experts that immediately understand what thesis is inscribed or materialized here, or put into this formula. But as soon as you would like to speak to a broader audience, you need some kind of help, yeah? And laying, this is, again, returning to the footnote maybe, to laying open the sources, the process, and maybe looking for formats that are somewhere between the 700 pages, and it can also be in other media, as we saw, can be placing other objects in the same room, and also experimental setups in a laboratory, of course, are assemblages of matter apparatus, people, written theses, so it has to be a bit more complex than just positioning something on the table to speak for itself in any discipline, I think.
Yes, if I may respond to that directly, I think also to avoid misunderstandings, the idea I think would not be to define some kind of fixed format, like a modus operandi or a certain type of, let's say, type of object. It's as if we would say, now we go for 200 pages instead of 700. That's not the answer, because if somebody writes a dissertation of 3,000 pages, she wanted that, and it was good that she did. So I will not limit that. That's not the idea. It's not about like arguing statistically or anything like that. If the thing needs it, give it the space. But on the other hand, what I find interesting, not to be melancholic or not to kill the Dr. Phil, is we can also learn from other practices, and with we, I mean like university-style, university doctorates. We can learn from other disciplines, because if you want to come to the point, if you want to foster, if you want to highlight the argument, the question, the thesis, it is helpful to get rid of, the jungle of paperwork and focus on the question, go back to the question. What did you want to say when you started writing? And then it can be that after 3 years you say, well, 100 pages is much better than 300. It's not that this is the target, but it can be helpful. But to do that, you need to understand, why are we here? Why do we do this? And that's why I find it interesting, like Céline also said, we have here a milieu, we have here like some kind of a community that thinks differently. And if I was asked to write my dissertation again now, here, it would be completely different. And that's what I find interesting. It's not that I say, get rid of it or something. That's why I also don't get melancholic. It's different. Simon. Oh yes, over there. Simon has a question. You have a mic? Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know how to phrase this, because I'm definitely on thin ice. Because I want to ask you to talk about education in Germany in class. Not as a native informant, it's difficult to phrase it properly, but in the spirit of language games and this idea of the Dr. Phil, perhaps I would argue that one of the reasons why we should inhabit it in artistic practice and in a school like this one is because of the symbolic function it has within the system of class in this country. So, myself being a doctor professor, I can tell that the treatment I get from authorities in this country is vastly different than when I came here with no title and as a foreigner. So for those reasons I think it's useful. And I would argue what I understand from the German educational system, now we're talking at the top of the pyramid, but we can go to the bottom of the Grundschule and how it moves into Sekundarstufe and Abitur, and who gets to go where and who gets to do it, when you choose to do academia, and how. It seems to me that it's more of a conservative than a neoliberal system, but I could be wrong. Probably Amrei would have more to say on this than I. that mainly wants to ensure that Germany has a stable elite and make sure that those from other backgrounds do not enter positions of power and knowledge to the same degree. Whereas in a lot of other countries, we are very keen on, in the UK for example, to have examples of what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism, which is to show how inclusive the neoliberal system is by bringing the POC person into a position of power, by giving them degrees. It seems to me that in Germany, the education system is made so that people basically from working class and migrant backgrounds do not enter higher education. So if that's the case, and again it's just I'm postulating, I really don't know, then perhaps we really should try and give as many Dr. Phils from someone who is not considered doctorable, namely artists and practitioners, rather than just people in medicine, law, and the rest of it.
Yeah, and I mean what you've just been, so what you said is also in the statistics. You can see very clearly that people from a non-academic background, they have very few chances to climb up to get the doctor fit. It's really significant that you see that. And also with regard to, so I mean, I see very clearly that I am a very privileged person in this whole system because my parents are academics, I'm a white German cis female, and I have been in a very privileged position compared to others. For instance, I had a colleague whose allowance to stay in Germany was connected to her having a contract. And for me it was of course an issue that once the contract ends I get unemployment money, but I get that at least. And she would wonder whether she gets kicked out of the country and all those little things. And I mean, apart from that, I think we should also be very clear that the political situation that we are in Germany right now, which I am really afraid how this is going to develop, also sends a very clear sign to people from other countries to think about whether they want to come here. I've been talking to people in research institutions in Eastern Germany where they say, okay, our researchers from other countries, we will put them in a taxi, we will not let them walk home because they need to be afraid that something will happen to them. And I think that is really horrible, and also maybe that's the point that we haven't discussed so far, but there is a responsibility for all of us, especially in academia, to stand up for democracy, because democracy is the ground that we are doing everything that we are doing on. And if this goes away, then things will be very horrible for several reasons, but it will also destroy everything that we have been talking about here. So I think that's also something that we need to make sure, and we need to put people in a position, especially privileged ones like myself, to speak up for democracy, because otherwise things will get bad.
Absolutely. So you could also say that. Sit down. Yes. So you could also say that the resilience of academic places is part of that democracy, because usually we are like cells there where you learn democracy, working with each other, and if these cells are somehow harmed, then it is a big problem for the entire society. Usually they have model character. Sorry, you wanted to?
Much more prosaic observation.
Prosaic. Okay. So, no. I just thought that it's good to hear those also these different voices, because that's what we're here. It's not about finding a solution here at some kind of podium and say that's the answer from experts, but to have a common ground first. And we haven't had that common ground so far because we didn't have a chance to talk about this project at all here. I mean, we did it here and there, in this room and in that room and at that level, but now we start finally having this discussion to start designing something new, and that's most important for me, not throw away something established in a haste just to have something totally new, but to find something that somehow convinces us in the first one. You're skeptical, okay. But sorry, that was...
No, I just wanted to thank you for this, because it also expands on the role of universities and artistic research beyond some of the very actually conventional ways in which we've been talking about it, which I would translate as perhaps, getting student applications for people who blatantly need a visa is actually a good reason to apply to a university place. And maybe it's something that we should be able to discuss more openly, which also has different consequences, for example, on language requirements, the ability or the inability to speak German as a requirement for studying here or elsewhere. I'd just like to put that in the table because it is something that we often look down upon. And perhaps this is within the expanding democratic role of universities and their responsibility towards the future of democracy.
Yeah, maybe I can add to Simon Sheikh's comment. I think what you observed is actually to some degree spot on. We're talking about systemic racism, of course, and all the intersectional parts that come with it, sexism, etc. But I think there has been a shift in Germany, from 50s, 60s with the immigrant movements, the waves, where it had become a bit better, and I think we're now going through a backlash where even, doctor titles are being questioned whether one has it or not. I think these are very subtle registers of racism. What my observation though in Germany is that, whereas yes, you're absolutely right, once you have that professor title, people in the, let's say, institutions where you have to register for your Anmeldung, etc., treat you differently. I think the class system is a bit more, how do you say, is more osmotic, so to say. It's not like England where you talk about working class, etc. That's a bit of a more rigid system, but then academia, and I had said it in the very beginning, I was dying to get out of the German system. That's why I had studied abroad. Also financing myself through work. So through the PhDs, most of us have worked. We have never stopped working while doing our PhDs. So I think of course we have to talk about systemic racism and these degrees and how open is education for people who are not bio-German, as it's called in Germany, which is quite a difficult term in itself, I guess. Yeah, but I think Gerriet wanted to maybe close and maybe a last question from the audience. I'm not sure how we do with time. I think we have to come to a close.
Yeah. Maybe only short. Thank you, Sam. I think it's super important to address this. However, if you look to the UK, I always tell my colleagues, look to the UK. That's the horror of our dawn. Because I have so many esteemed colleagues who are losing their jobs right now as we speak, like tons of professors. Unthinkable in Germany, like losing their jobs. And if you look like Goldsmith, how many people, were just fired this year, last year, it's a pattern. And look where they come from. Like one of the, I'm not going to talk about names here, but one of the most brilliant thinkers, he's of course, professor, working class, lost his job. No way to get into the system again. So will it really help us to issue more doctorates here? Because we see what's coming. In my field, like sound art, media art, but also humanities, see where the cuts are in the UK. Look, like writings down, sonic art is not existing. Performance theory at Roehampton, like 20 people over 30 years, one department. Now they're down to 2 within 24 months. So, and they all have doctor titles, or most of them, and they are professors. Of course, so that's one thing. The other thing I want to say is, really we should, like one of the most important seminars I was in at the Media Art School in Cologne, the name was Zeigen und Verstecken, showing and hiding. But this is what we do in art. Like we show something in the exhibition, we leave out the process mostly. So if we think about what we can achieve with these artistic research, doctorates also, we should open up the processes. I can only say that again. Like if we just put out the result, we will have a different discussion. But if we open the processes and we discuss those, then it's much richer, and then we can probably come up with different ideas.
But I actually like that we're talking about, institutional or systemic racism. We're talking about the neoliberal aspect of design education. We're talking about how you can even hijack a doctorate study in order to get to Germany. I see that a lot at HFK Bremen, but it's true we can't openly discuss it because they're also equally capable content-wise, right? But I'd like to think of it as a wonderful opportunity if education helps, that people can live free and discuss free. I'm all up for it, but maybe you would like to have the last word, Amrei? And then Matthias, thank you.
Yeah, I just thought about that there is, so it's not a coincidence if you talk about the UK, for instance, or if you take a look at the Netherlands, which disciplines suffer from all those cuttings, that are the humanities and the arts. And that is because those disciplines are so important for us as a society and also for democracy. I mean, there is a reason why the government in the Netherlands tries to get rid of the humanities, because they are powerful in terms of helping to save democracy, I think. And I think we need to keep this in mind. It's not just our little niche discussion that we are having about the conditions of doing research, doing a PhD or Dr. Phil. It's a bigger picture that we need to see there. And if we do that, then we see how much potential there is to work for a world that is maybe getting better and not getting worse, because at the moment it very often looks that it's getting worse. If we strengthen those disciplines, and that's, I think, also something that governments need to see and that politicians need to see how much potential there is. So I'm just wanting to highlight that this is not just a small discussion in academia, but it's a discussion that has effects way beyond that, and I think that's worth keeping in mind.
Absolutely, I say from my part, absolutely. Perhaps there's different opinions on that, but I think we agree. I want to come to a conclusion. I was also indicated that, yes, there's comment. Please, of course. You know, la disputation.
No, it's just to when we're talking about the kind of economization and how educations are structured, there's a major difference between the UK and every other European country, which is that most European countries decide roughly, here it would be just a Land Baden-Württemberg, how many nurses do we roughly need in a generation? How many artists do we need? This is political struggle and economic. It's not like that in the UK. It's completely liberalized. Any college can offer any degree they want if they can recruit students. This is why, so it's that kind of liberalization of the educational system that they've had that has led to the crises. So it's a direct outcome of neoliberalism. So I would say, luckily, we're far from that because we haven't liberalized the economy of education yet here. So we would need to do that first, run it for 20 years until it ran into the ground, and then we would have the problems that the British have. So that's just a comment.
Oh yeah, so have the bigger picture, as you said. So to conclude, we will not wrap this up. We will not have an answer. We will not have a protocol, minutes that people can sign to. It was to open the space, to have this discussion, or let's say 2 points that you mentioned. That is one, we have to have the bigger picture and strengthen see the bigger picture, like in which world are we in when we talk about higher education and doctorates in particular. And the other one that I also noted that is for me like a formula is open the process, not the result. Open the process. So we're not talking about a piece of paper, but about the way to get there. It sounds simple, but it's not, because it is part of the institutionalized system of knowledge that has evolved over 500 years. And it's really hard to change. And you can see different countries have different traditions, different mindsets, different expectations towards higher education, and so on and so forth. So what I wrote down in the beginning for preparation of this, I then skipped it, was that I made a little note that given the fact that we have so libraries full of books that nobody wants to read, and you could get so melancholic about the fact that there's so much to read and you don't have the time for that in your life. And thought, no melancholy, because you could say if you try to learn from the past, you could get melancholic, because why do we do this for 500 years? We didn't get anywhere. No, we did get somewhere. And it's not only hard to learn from the past, it's much more difficult to learn from the present. Like, where are we? What do we want? That was the idea of this. Like, what can we learn from the present practices, and what kind of survey overview picture do we need? And as soon as we at least have that kind of element of a picture, then we can start modeling something that will be a new HFG 2.0, that is HFG on doctorate level, and not just some doctorate you get anywhere, but something that we say that is our way. You know, this is the way.
I think we have to come to an end, but maybe just to be clear, I think artistic practices, or wherever they come from poetry, from literature, or any other realm, be they visual, be they spatial, they are not Beipackzettel, they're not manual instructions to the practice itself. So the text never is just a manual. I think that must be very, very clear, but I think also in times where books are burned and knowledge is really not represented as achievable, I think it's very good to allow for these other kind of systems, and I hope that we can continue the discussion, and thank you all for staying with us for this amount of time and also contributing, and also, of course, thank you very much for our guests, Amrei and Gerriet, for coming and joining us here at the HFG, and all the other guests, and we have another panel, but also I would like to thank Professor Dr. Matthias Bruhn and Professor Dr. Désirée who just escaped again, but was here part of our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.